Welcome to Pathophysiology. Hopefully this semester you have a lot of fun watching these videos and playing along with the game. And I call it a game because differential diagnosis is just like a game. Throughout the semester I'll introduce the rules to the game. Just like any game that you start playing at first, you're maybe a little bit hesitant or worried about the game because you don't know the rules, but don't worry about it. Throughout the semester I'm going to slowly introduce any new rules, make sure they're clear, and then let you work on your own from there. The cool thing about the game, once you learn the rules, it's so easy and so fun to play the game. And diagnosing pathophysiology is just like that. We're talking about the physiology because when you understand how physiology works and you break any one piece of that chain, you create this reaction that changes everything. So we're going to talk a little bit about the physiology, and hopefully you remember your physiology and your anatomy because you're going to have it all semester long. But then we're going to talk about the patho part, so the disease part of it. We're going to talk about what happens when you change one element in that pathway, or what happens when you introduce something to the body that breaks the pathway. So, like I said, we're going to talk about a lot of the rules. We're going to talk about the basics too. I'll refresh your anatomy, refresh your physiology, and then we're going to apply those rules to what would happen if you broke that. And you probably remember from physiology things like the endocrine system, or you can think, pathway of hormones. If you turn off any one hormone in the pathway, it's like a domino effect. It shuts off all the other hormones in the pathway. Cardiovascular system. If you block flow to an organ, you know what happens to the organ. It starves, it dies, and then that'll be a symptom. So we'll talk about how to apply those rules from knowing your physiology. Also, like I said, I'm going to be here for guidance. So I'm going to try and make sure that everything's accessible to you. The directions in the syllabus we'll go over when we meet in class for the first day. I'll talk about how you do the homework, how you submit the homework, how you get everything turned in, how you know exactly what things are due and when they're due. And I try and keep everything as consistent as possible throughout the semester, which we'll talk about that first day that we meet in class too. I want to make sure that every week you can count on the same steps to get things done. So you get into a nice pattern and the flow just makes it easier so you can focus on the learning and not wondering what you have to do. Right, so hopefully throughout the semester I'll keep you on the edge of your seat. And I really want to keep you thinking, oh my God, I can't believe this really happens, or is this really possible? So I'm going to introduce a lot of diseases that maybe you haven't heard of, but you might be introduced into. Which brings me to another thing. I'm not a big fan of actually beating into your head diseases you'll probably never ever hear of again, or they're so rare that somebody wrote a paper on it one time and that's why we have the name of the disease. I really focus on the primary things you'll have to deal with. I sometimes do list off some diseases that they're kind of rare, but there's a chance that you might be introduced to them, especially if it helps reiterate a concept from physiology, or so that it helps you understand another disease or another pathway. So if you hear something rare, I might actually point out that you don't have to memorize this, but you really have to understand the concept. And then, like I said, hopefully you have a lot of fun this semester learning those different things. So hopefully you're ready to have your mind a little bit challenged and have some fun doing it. So let's start with some history. This is an extremely general history of disease. If you could buy a whole textbook on the history of disease and all the things that have happened, but I just think it's kind of interesting that man's been on the earth, depending on what perspective you look at, evolutionarily, about 3 million years, and we've been getting sick ever since day one. So since the first man was out there, we've had diseases. What's interesting is that how we've treated the diseases, because of course from the biblical perspective, God created these diseases to punish man, as a lot of the philosophies. And so it really was supported by the church that if you got sick, then you were a sinner, or there was something wrong with you. And then if there was no mystery, or if there was no way to identify what was causing it, and it was this big mystery, then we'd come up with these really weird treatments that were totally anecdotal, which means if we treated one person with the disease with this one treatment, and it worked, then presto, it was a miracle cure, and everybody should be treated. Not necessarily giving credit to the body having repaired itself while they were going through this ridiculous treatment. So I'll show you some of those. So one of the oldest diseases that we think of was actually cured by drilling a hole in the person's head. So they think that caveman or Neanderthal, they found evidence that these old therapies were used on them as old as 10,000 years ago. And we can only imagine that maybe somebody had a sinus infection or a migraine headache, so what did they do? They drilled a hole in their head. They thought, well, this person must have angered the gods, or they had a demon inside of them, so if you drill a hole, it would let the demons escape. What's interesting is that we still do this, and if you know the name of drilling a hole in the head or cutting a hole in the skull, it's called a craniotomy. But of course we we understand the disease a little bit better and the purpose of it. It's interesting when you look at some of these things like this squared hole, and you can see where the cuts. Imagine when this was actually made 10,000 years ago, they just had a sharp rock. So could you imagine the person with this bad headache, someone cutting away at their head with a sharp rock and just saying, one more minute, we're almost in. We're almost about to let this demon go free. I think at the point where someone was cutting onto my head, I'd totally forget about the pain in my head. And I'd be more worried about the pain on the outside. Another excuse was biblical uncleanliness. So 2,000 years before Christ, there was this disease. It didn't have a name, Hansen's disease, at the time, but it was one of the most common diseases or plagues on man. And today we call it leprosy, and they actually call it leprosy in the Bible too. But they assumed that leprosy was this punishment from God for being a sinner. So what's interesting is the treatment that they used. Get 2 birds, kill one, dip the live bird in the blood of the dead one, sprinkle the blood on the leper 7 times. It was this ritual of going through this. Leprosy is actually more of a skin issue and what's happening to the surface of the skin, the muscle, and it can actually dig down to the bones. But when you cut off circulation, then you could actually lose fingers. So when we talk about leprosy later, we'll actually talk about more of the common things and not the extreme versions so much. I love this one too. So if you can't come up with the actual cause, they must be a vampire. It's funny because there are a lot of history going back with vampirism, and they think that one of the main causes, there are actually a couple causes of quote-unquote vampirism, was TB. So when you look at symptoms of TB, the person's eyes were really bloodshot, they looked very evil-looking, their skin was usually really pale. They didn't feel really comfortable going out in the light because it hurt their eyes, because of the problems with their eyes. And if they started coughing up blood, it almost looked like instead of the blood coming from them, is that they ate blood from somebody else. And what was really interesting is that when one person in a household got TB and the other people started slowly getting sick afterwards, they kind of accredited that to the first person or the first victim being a vampire, and they were actually sucking the life out of the other people. So when that person would die and they would bury them, just to make sure that they didn't come back from the dead, they would actually dig them up and then put a stake through their heart. And of course, because they had TB, they've got a bacteria growing inside of their lungs. It's causing all these gases inside the lungs, and just natural decomposition of corpses cause the gases. So as soon as they lunged this stake into their chest, because of all the oozing fluids in their throat and their vocal cord, around their vocal cords, when they pushed down the gases, it sounded like they sighed. So it was just affirming that that person was actually an undead person and they had to kill them. So it's kind of interesting when you look back at some of the beliefs that people had back at the time. There was actually another disease called porphyria that people thought might be vampirism too, and these people had light sensitivities. Their skin would actually get sores on it if they were exposed to light too long. But it was just funny because back then you could attribute lots of different diseases to being the same problem. And these diseases kind of become legendary at some point. And of course, you've heard the books about vampires and everything. At some point, the people started shifting and started understanding that there was actually some kind of social connection between some diseases, like syphilis, or what they called the French disease. Syphilis was that if you were hanging out with the wrong people or you were doing unspeakable things with the wrong types of people, this was kind of a thing that you got from their sins. So it was handed from one person to another. And what's also interesting are the cures. To cure syphilis, you would actually consume mercury or rub it all over your skin. And it was true that mercury would kill the syphilis, but the problem was that we all know that mercury also kills the person. So mercury makes you go a little bit crazy. Syphilis makes you go a little bit crazy. And if somebody was going through this progression with syphilis, some of the later stages was insanity, and they thought that the demons were actually coming out of the person at that point, or the demon was completely taking over for this immoral behavior that person committed. So it's just kind of interesting sometimes. And then at some point they thought, well, geez, they could have these social diseases, but what if you weren't touching those people? What if you were just around or in the area? So they had this thing called miasma, which was diseases that were gases or transferred by gases or vapors. So you only had to be in the breathing range or the breathing area of the person to get these. And that was a common belief actually with the bubonic plague. So we know nowadays that the plague was carried on or through fleas on rats. That's how people got it, but people didn't really think that much. So there were a lot of these diseases that instead of being, touching someone or making physical contact or even sinning, they couldn't explain why even wealthy and clerical or clergy people were getting the plague. So they said, well, it must be just this gas or vapor that goes through the air that's causing it. So some of the cures are also really interesting. Oh, I love this cartoon. It's kind of funny. So the earliest cures, some of them are really interesting. Like down here, this was actually to help you get rid of kidney stones. So they would dig this up into your urethra and help you to pull out the stone, which I just could not imagine that. For hemorrhoids, they would slice the hemorrhoid and let you bleed, and then they would take a hot iron from a fireplace and then cauterize the hemorrhoid. So pretty extreme examples. This was interesting too. If women were hysterical, it must be a disease. There was something wrong in their head, so they would actually go to a doctor, and a doctor would give them a vaginal massage until they actually, I think you know what finally happened. And it was called hysterical paroxysm, which meant basically the woman had an orgasm and she was cured of her hysteria. But it was inappropriate for her husband to do this. She actually had to go to a medical professional to have it done. And then some of the other interesting situations are like lobotomies. Lobotomy became kind of a household cure for a lot of things. At first it was for mental diseases. They'd shove an ice pick-like structure up and into your frontal lobe and scramble it. And it changed your personality, if you remember from physiology, so it changed their personality. Basically, it would make them pretty much a vegetable. And then they started using it for the criminally insane or people that were too dangerous. Or eventually what happened, and by the way, the guy that did the lobotomies got a Nobel Prize for it, but eventually what happened is that he would start performing it on housewives if they were unsatisfied with their life, and then he would do it to small children if they were having behavioral disorders, and then he started killing people accidentally, and they stopped doing it. So bloodletting was a really common cure back then. And this actually went all the way back to the Greeks. They believed that you had these 4 humors, which were fluids in your body. And if you have bad humors, by relieving the bad humors, like the blood, it would give you more space for other good humors that were able to help you or cure you. And man, bloodletting just kept going on. Even if I remember right, George Washington was actually, when he got really sick before he died, they were doing bloodletting on him too, and they think that that's what contributed to his death. But it was safer to have those bad liquids out of you instead of keeping the bad ones in. They would also introduce one disease to try and cure another one. So, for instance, they would introduce malaria because malaria would actually cure syphilis. The bacteria that carries syphilis, when you heat it hot enough, it would actually get killed. And malaria's primary symptom is a really high fever. So if somebody got malaria, then it would cure them of syphilis. The problem is that malaria is also fatal, so they could die from the malaria instead. And what's really interesting is if you've ever heard of Dr. Heimlich, of course, the Heimlich maneuver fame, Dr. Heimlich, before he died, suggested that malaria could be used as a cure for AIDS. Because malaria raises the body temperature, they thought, well, geez, if you raise the body temperature, it'll cook the virus and kill the virus. It was basically the person's body fixing it. And we know that there's a treatment for malaria is quinine or quinine. And so if you gave them malaria to get rid of AIDS, then you could give them the quinine to get rid of the malaria. So it was kind of this trade-off of how sick you're willing to get. So even some of these old remedies we kind of use today, even leeches are coming back, or maggots are coming back as treatments. And then I love this next treatment. Basically, if all else fails, you blow smoke up their bum. So they believe that if you took tobacco smoke and gave them a tobacco smoke enema, it would help cure them because tobacco is considered this like panacea. It had these chemicals in it that would kill well, it wasn't bacteria back then, but kill bad things that were in your body or help eliminate the bad things that were in your body. There was a movie a long time ago about Kellogg, Mr. Kellogg, who is famous for his cereals, but he actually had this institute where he would bring people to use all these holistic cures for everything under the sun. And this was one of the treatments that he used in his quote-unquote clinic. So kind of the theory behind the treatments were they were mostly anecdotal. If somebody did something and then they get cured, there was definitely no way it was credited to the human body. It was actually because this weird treatment actually fixed them. And of course, today, evidence-based medicine is based on science. So we know how things work because we've actually experimented and tested. And this kind of goes back to great scientists like Pasteur, not the first scientist, but really famous because he came up with the germ theory of disease. So Pasteur, what he did is he took a thing called a gooseneck flask, and the gooseneck kind of had a bent neck in it, and he boiled the fluid so that it would kill the bacteria and any viruses that were in it, and then let it set. And took another vial, boiled it, and let it set, but he broke the top off the gooseneck so that it could be exposed to chemicals in the environment or germs that were floating through the air. And he found that the one that had exposure to the air would start growing fungus or molds or start growing things inside of it, where the one that was sealed off from the air and didn't allow the air to make contact with it didn't grow these things. So he knew that cooking the fluid would actually kill off these germs. Before Pasteur, there was actually this belief called spontaneous generation, where they thought that these diseases just spontaneously happened, or even that the things that caused the diseases could spontaneously change from one disease to the other. So he actually started proving the germ theory, which eventually led to us being more sterile in our medical environments and our practices, or even the way that we prepare food. So you've heard of pasteurizing, which is named after Louis Pasteur. And of course, he's gonna be one of my favorite scientists because he also created better beer production. So he helped modify the way we make beer. Some of the other ways that we treated were inoculations, which was giving someone the actual disease to try and help get them over it. Which unfortunately, if you give them a disease, it could kill them. So this became a little bit more modified by the smallpox vaccine, is what we call it now. But originally, when groups of people would get smallpox, they would actually pop one of the pustules. So you can see this man covered in the pustules. And they would introduce the chemicals in the pustule to another person to expose them to it. And if they lived, then they didn't get smallpox again. If they died, then, well, of course, they never got smallpox again. But that was just kind of the way things worked. And then Edward Jenner came along, and Jenner looked at what they were doing with inoculations before. And the word inoculation means to graft, so taking it from one person to another. And then he studied what was happening to cows' maids. So these women that would milk the cows, they would get cowpox on their hands, the same kind of pustules, but it didn't go all the way through their body and kill them. And basically the people that got cowpox would never get smallpox. So what he did is he started extracting the cowpox pustule fluid and then injecting that into people, and they called it a vaccine. So the name vaccine actually came from, oops, I think I have it on the next slide, actually came from the name cow. So cowpox was vaccinia. So to vaccinate someone was to give them this sample of cowpox. Right? And what's interesting is that we figured out that this is such a good way to treat things that back in, was it like the 1800s? I'm sure it's on that little book. But yeah, it was 1800s. It was like early 1800s, 1840-ish, something like that, when it was actually mandated that you had to get a vaccine in England. And then it became this huge issue because they felt like vaccinations were invasion of personal privacy, and there were public protests, and people got really upset, and they didn't want to be vaccinated because they felt it wasn't it was against their rights as citizens to have this pushed on you. And another reason I bring this up is it's interesting because nowadays, 200 years later almost, we have the same kind of situations. 200 years, about 150 years. So my math's not perfect, but anyway, we have the same issues that are coming up over and over again. So it's interesting how history sometimes repeats itself when you're not expecting it. So the first homework, and now let me explain how homework works. So homework, what I'm going to do is I put up the questions in the slides, so you have to watch the videos to know what to do for homework. And I usually put the number up here in the top corner. I don't know why I say usually. I'll always put the number in the top corner, and I'll even put homework question across it, and they'll have this little guy. So this is the heading of every homework question. At this point, you can stop, well, after I explain it. When you see these slides, you'll want to pause the video, write down the question, and then you're going to type the answers onto a Word document and you're going to submit them online through a Word document for me to read. I don't want super huge drawn out explanations. I'm putting these points here because these are the main things I look for in your explanation. It can be a few sentences, it can be as much as a paragraph. If you write me a page on anything, it's always going to be too much. So really brief explanations. So here are the first questions. First, what epidemic hit the United States in 1918? And then what caused it? How do we treat it then? And is it still a threat today? So is it something we have to worry about? And if it is still a threat today, then how do we treat it now? So this is something you can actually summarize in a few sentences. This was the epidemic that hit in 1918. It was caused by blank. We treated it with this. And then it either is a problem today, and this is how we treat it now, or it's not a problem today because we eradicated it or whatever. So there's your first homework question. You just put that in a Word document. Anytime you see this little logo or icon that has the www on it, it means that I'm encouraging you to search the web. So the textbook is really handy. You can probably find this answer in the textbook, but a lot of people are going to be using the internet for searching, and I'm really promoting you learning how to use the internet better to find answers to questions. So it's amazing even how people come into the doctor and they already know a lot of the answers to the questions you're about to ask the doctor, but they ask them anyways because of the internet and the availability. So here are some suggested search engines. Of course, I'm a huge fan of Google. But when you're using the internet to answer these questions, you need to cite your source. And I only want reputable sources. So things that end in things like .gov or .edu. And I'm still a little bit more hesitant on the .edu because there are a lot of people out there that, like instructors, that put their own personal opinions into things, which I'm guilty of too. I put my own personal opinions in. You'll hear that anytime I talk about smoking. I'll have my own personal opinion. .mil is for military or .org. Don't use Wikipedia though. So when you're looking for your answers, do not use Wikipedia. Anything that has tons of ads, you have to be cautious of. So even if there's a .org, but there are lots of ads all over the sides, that means they're trying to sell something. It may not be the thing that you're looking at right now, but they're trying to sell things. So they're trying to generate people coming through and generate some business from it. So look more towards the .edus and the .govs than anything that has lots of ads. And then another point is, did that author cite their source? So when you're reading through it, if it's a good web page and they're giving you some quote-unquote factual information that you're going to need to know, you should be able to scroll to the bottom of the page and find the source at the bottom. So when you're looking at the general web pages, they usually put their sources at the bottom. And then in my recommendation, just go straight to that source and look, is it a credible site? Did it come from a reputable journal? And then you know it's a good source that you can cite. All right. And then I want your source link after your answers. So you can find all of these pieces right here on one web page. Just cite the web page after you write your answer. So this should only take you a couple minutes. In fact, when you're looking through, you could probably do the keywords epidemic 1918. Or you could be more specific, epidemic United States 1918. And you'll find all these answers in that one site. I guarantee it. So now's the time to pause the video, write down the question, and then you can come back later and answer the question if you want. Right, we're going to move on now. So a very brief history of physiologies. I only have a few slides left and I want to get through them. So I'm not going to explain the entire history of physiology, even though since I'm a physiologist, I love talking about physiology and the history. It's just fascinating. But there are a lot of famous physiologists throughout history and a lot of people that weren't necessarily just physiologists that did a lot of physiology study. I mean, there's some really great ones like Vesalius, and I'll show you a lot of pictures from him. He was one of the original anatomists. Of course, Da Vinci was another anatomist that was also working on understanding the physiology of the body or how things work. But up until really the 1800s, an anatomist and a physiologist were exactly the same. And anatomy, if you've ever heard me get on my soapbox, anatomy is about studying the dead things. I mean, we take something that's dead, we slice it apart, we put it under a microscope, or we slice it apart to look at what it is, and we name what that thing is. Physiology is more of the understanding of the living, so it's a little bit more challenging. We use special tools to keep the person alive while we're studying physiology. But in the 1800s, we started dividing, or somebody said, well, geez, there's a huge difference between anatomy and physiology. So we started separating it. And some of the most famous physiologists that really paved the way for physiology would have been William Harvey, who identified circulation in the body and identified how veins and arteries worked. Before that, they really didn't have a clear understanding. They thought maybe gases moved through that. There were a lot of philosophies, but until William Harvey came along and actually published a book on it, there was no definitive guide to what was really happening in the body. And then I keep talking about diseases, infectious diseases, so I figured I should give a little bit of credit here. But Paul Ehrlich actually described the first processes that happened in the body, because we didn't really understand physiologically what was happening, and that's why all those weird treatments came up. But when Paul Ehrlich started describing how he thought these little magic bullets that were traveling through your blood were finding this bacteria or this infectious agent and attacking it, then we really started looking at what's going on with immunology. So he's kind of the father of immunology. If you Google father of immunology, it'll probably take you all the way back to Hippocrates, because Hippocrates had his theories, but he didn't really understand what was going on in the body. So Paul Ehrlich called these things magic bullets, and today we call them antibodies, and we know exactly how they work, and we use antibodies for tons of things. But it's amazing because 110 years ago, Paul Ehrlich was actually describing these things that he couldn't even see at that point. He just kind of theorized. And it's amazing because here you can see the cell, and you can see the receptors along the surface of the cell, and you can see the antibody binding to receptors. So he really kind of understood without being able to see it clearly. Right? And then, of course, today we have a lot of physiological equipment. We can actually do things that study the anatomy and physiology at the same time, like MRIs and CAT scans. So we've come a very long way. But the reason I'm talking about physiology, the brief segment, is because this is pathophysiology. And everything in pathophysiology really revolves around understanding the physiology, understanding where we come from in the history, and then also understanding how evidence-based medicine works. So by us understanding the physiology and things like Paul Ehrlich's discoveries, we've actually taken our history and changed it tremendously. At the turn of the century in the 1900s, you can see what the top killers were in the world. You've got tuberculosis, pneumonia, diarrhea. Most of these things were actually caused by infective agents. So TB, of course, the mycobacterium, tuberculosis. Pneumonia could be caused by lots of things, viruses, bacteria. Diarrhea, things like cholera would cause diarrhea. Of course, to go to Mexico and drink the water, you know what I'm talking about. So these things would kill people. Nowadays, you don't even see diarrhea on the list. You don't see TB on the list. You still see pneumonia because there are lots of actually causes of pneumonia. And then heart disease back in the day had other causes, not just pure physiological. So when you look at the change between 100 years ago and close to today, not exactly today, you can see that back here you had a lot of infectious agents that would cause problems. Here you have a lot of physiological problems. You can change the shift, or some things that are psychological problems. So the last couple slides here, evidence-based medicine. Why do we need it? We need it to understand and diagnose. So evidence-based medicine revolves around knowing your physiology, knowing the scientific evidence, knowing scientifically what works, knowing the progression of the disease, which we're going to talk a lot about this semester, and then practicing evidence-based medicine builds algorithms or written directives based on what we know about physiology and diseases. So the big picture here is that you want to understand pathophysiology because it really allows you to predict. It allows you to take the symptoms that you're seeing, give a differential diagnosis, and actually name the disease so you can predict or understand the disease. And at the same time, once we know a disease, we can turn that back around and we can identify the symptoms that we expect to see. And then this is kind of the summary of this section. The next time that you watch a video, it'll be talking about definitions and explaining the definitions that happen in pathophysiology. So I'll leave you with the last cartoon, and good luck. Make sure you do that last homework question, or that first homework question, and we'll see you in the next video.